Um, oh, we're being recorded. That's good. Okay, so a brief overview of free trade generally. So given the current economic climate, it would be understandable if anybody on this call who's listening has an adverse reaction to the term free trade at this point, or the idea of trade treaties generally. But I think it's important to remember and to set out at the outset that for decades, trade amongst countries has grown and has resulted in the world's wealth growing. So here in Canada, we have roughly 1 in 6 jobs that are linked to exports. Economists estimate that incomes in Canada are 15 to 40% higher thanks to freer trade. And so although the trade war with our largest trading partner might sour our general feelings about free trade, the merits of free trade are well known. They include innovation, economies of scale, market competition, and increased access to products. And that hasn't changed. So while opening doors is obviously only the first step, I think our next 2 speakers are going to help get to steps beyond that. But it's really notable that Canada is the only G7 economy with comprehensive free trade access to the entire G7 and European Union. Canada has 15 free trade agreements that cover 61% of the world's GDP and open markets to 1.5 billion consumers worldwide. So next slide, please. So a little bit more just generally is that free trade or agreements or trade treaties are agreements between countries that set out the rules for how goods and services can be exchanged. They provide a framework or are supposed to that reduces barriers like tariffs, quotas, and other restrictions. And so because of the wide range of free trade agreements that Canada has, it's important to recognize at this time that that should make it easier to diversify trading partners and reduce reliance on the United States. As Canada continues to face challenges from the US, it's important for the federal government to remain proactive in negotiating these trade deals and for the business community to support those. Next slide, please. And so that brings us to the elephant in the room, which is CUSMA. And so I suspect that at least some of you are wondering what the point of free trade agreements is if countries can simply break them, as we're seeing from the United States. And so we'll hear more about the current state of affairs on this from one of our other speakers today, but I just wanted to recognize and sort of acknowledge that these actions by the United States are unprecedented. They're unusual and they're likely not legal. And so these actions are not a good reason to throw away the free trade economy that's been developed over decades. As we've heard probably ad nauseum at this point, President Trump is acting via an executive order to put these tariffs in place. The tariffs are most likely in breach of CUSMA and are being enacted in reliance on what is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is an American law that's existed since 1978. It has been used a number of times, but this is notably the first time that it's been used to apply tariffs. And so I think we need to consider what's happening with the United States analogous to a business contract where one party doesn't comply with its obligations. So it might be stressful and a damaging experience for both sides, but it doesn't mean that that business wouldn't continue to contract with other companies or with people in the future. And I think we need to look at free trade similarly. I just want to touch briefly on remission requests because this is important to any business who may find themselves having to pay tariffs on that retaliatory tariff list. So remission is just the term for, it represents an exception to the tariffs, and it's the government providing relief of otherwise applicable duties. It's important to note that the government of Canada has outlined a framework and process for how it will consider these remission requests for the tariffs on products from the United States. And under specific circumstances, this remission allows for relief from the payment of tariffs. The government of Canada has also stated that if it does impose further tariffs, as have been proposed and discussed, that the remission process would be available for those as well. So in relation to requests for remission of the tariffs, the government will consider requests in the following instances. The first one is to address situations where goods used as inputs cannot be sourced domestically, either on a national or regional basis, or reasonably from a non-US source. The second is to address on a case-by-case basis other exceptional circumstances that could have severe impacts on the Canadian economy. I meant to link, there's a process provided by the federal government, which I meant to link in this slide. I will update that before it gets sent out to the group. It's very clearly laid out the process, but always feel free to reach out with questions. Notably, the executive order that put these tariffs in place specified that there would be no drawback, which is another name for remission, or refund of duties available to U.S. businesses that are affected by the tariffs. And then lastly, I just want to touch on under CUSMA legal challenges. So I've been asked a number of times what can be done about what is going on with the actions taken by President Trump. Unfortunately for individuals and individual businesses, there's likely not a lot of recourse to his actions, but the government of Canada is challenging the US tariffs by filing dispute resolution claims at the World Trade Organization, which is a standard way of trying to settle disputes under these agreements. They're also filing dispute resolution claims under the rules of CUSMA itself. So just again, to tie that up, only governments can bring challenges to the World Trade Organization. Next slide, please. So moving away from sort of the legalities and generalities of trade agreements, I really wanted to highlight Durham's commitment as we work through what is clearly unprecedented. So as we've seen in many circumstances, Canada is not going down without a fight, and that's no different here in Durham. On March 5th, Durham Regional Chair and the mayors from all 8 local area municipalities in Durham issued a joint statement in support of the federal and provincial responses to tariffs. They also reiterated their commitment to supporting local businesses and residents. As you will know, the province of Ontario has said that it will not procure American goods. The federal government is looking at major purchases like the F-35 contract. And it's important that you know that municipal governments are also doing their part on this. Staff at the region have worked tirelessly and continue to identify opportunities for supply chain diversification, as well as opportunities for local production. Next slide, please. And so I think it's an understatement maybe at this point to say that this has been a stressful and uncertain time for a lot of us, and in varying ways. I'm choosing to look for the silver linings, and I think that Canadian businesses are too. It's who we are. So I've talked about the benefits of international free trade agreements, but there's also a free trade agreement within Canada, the CFTA. And if you know about the CFTA, you'll know that it has benefits for Canadian businesses, but it has long been argued that the agreement doesn't go far enough, and that internal trade barriers need to be removed, especially those related to labor mobility and regulatory standards. I would say one of the things from a procurement lens that we're really seeing this US trade war bring about are renewed discussions around the CFTA, and bringing these restrictions back into the spotlight. Moves have already been made to reduce barriers by the federal government in this respect, as well as a couple of provincial governments, and we are expecting to see more announcements forthcoming on changes to CFTA that will benefit local and Canadian businesses. The second opportunity is government procurement itself, so both in Canada and abroad. Many, if not all, of the GTHA municipalities are looking at ways to support Canadian businesses by spending their procurement dollars within Canada. So yesterday in Durham, at the Committee of the Whole, we saw a motion passed directing staff to adopt procurement strategies that prioritize Canadian and other non-US goods and services. Our buyers are actively seeking local alternatives to products that come from the United States. And you can expect to see more coming out of the region, both through Invest Durham, the task force, and our purchasing department generally, on products that we've identified as potential for local alternatives. Abroad, it's also important to note that CETA, which is the trade agreement with the European Union, provides massive opportunities in government procurement that have potentially not been tapped into since its creation just over 5 years ago. So the next two speakers are experts in helping businesses with export and trade diversification, and they will get into details on how Canadian companies can leverage Canada's free trade agreements. But as a municipal procurement lawyer, I really want to touch briefly on the opportunities created by CETA, specifically with respect to government procurement, because you may not know, or you may know, but CETA was the first free trade agreement to specifically give access to municipal level government procurement on both sides. So in total, government procurement opportunities that are open to Canadian companies, so Canadian companies contracting for government procurement in Europe, are worth an estimated $3.3 trillion annually. And while trade with the United States has always made the most sense geographically, with advances in technology and free access to these European markets, it's a great time for Canadian companies to take advantage of the opportunities that CETA offers. Detailed information on how to access government procurement specifically in the European Union is provided by the Government of Canada in the link that I have in this slide. We'll go to the next slide, which is me being done. And we'll move on to the practical help from other speakers. So as they said at the beginning, I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session, or you're free to reach out to me directly. And with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker, who's Bill Maheras.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? See me, hear me? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. Okay, if we can begin first with the first slide. Welcome, everybody. Thank you to Clarington and Durham for inviting us to speak to your group. We're really happy to be with you this afternoon, talk a little bit about some of the issues and strategies we're going on, make some suggestions as well for you. I need to put the elbows up logo onto my presentation as well. Thank you, Ashley, for including that. I'm going to cut and paste from your presentation and put that on future presentations as well. Next slide, please. I'm Bill Maheras. I'm a Trade Commissioner with Global Affairs Canada. I want to discuss this afternoon with you Canada's the current tariff situation and Canada's response. Talk a little bit about supports that are available for your businesses, businesses that might be affected by these tariffs, and strategies to mitigate the effect of tariffs, and then also help you start thinking about diversifying your export markets. I know Durham trades a lot with the United States, but let's talk a little bit about diversification and the programs and services we have to assist you in that respect. And then I guess Q&A we're holding to the end, so happy to do that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, where are we right now? As of March 20th, here's the current tariff situation. The Americans have hit us with tariffs for steel and aluminum, 25%. They've hit us with 10% tariffs on energy products, primarily oil and natural gas, on 10% there. They reduced it from 25 to 10 because they depend on Canadian oil and natural gas so heavily. Then there was a tariff levy of 25% as well on all products, with the exemption for any products that are CUSMA compliant. In other words, if you have a product that complies with CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, which is the new version of NAFTA. You might be familiar with NAFTA. The CUSMA is the new version. It's the Canadian terminology for it. The Americans call it USMCA. The Mexicans have another name for it. Anyways, there is an exemption for products that are CUSMA compliant until April 2nd. So April 2nd is a very important date. That is the date that the U.S. Commerce Secretary and President Trump have indicated that they're going to apply what are called reciprocal tariffs. They call these reciprocal tariffs on a number of products, not just in Canada and Mexico, but worldwide, to their trading partners. We don't know what these tariffs are going to look like. Frankly, trying to predict what the U.S. administration, this U.S. administration is doing is almost impossible. It changes on a daily basis, and there's no transparency or predictability to it, in contrast to every other U.S. administration since the Second World War, which has been very consistent, has used Congress to pass legislation. President Trump is using executive orders to pass rules and laws. As Ashley indicated, a lot of these are being challenged already. by judges, by opposition groups in the U.S. So we don't know how many will actually go through and become factual. So yeah, next slide, please. We've responded accordingly. In a trade dispute, I won't call it a war because we're friends with the Americans, but in a trade dispute, each party has to respond to an initial imposition of tariffs. So the Americans essentially started this. They imposed the tariffs on our products. We have to respond. So our first response on first of four stages was basically lobbying, negotiating, using our diplomatic representatives and our senior federal officials and even provincial officials as well to try to convince the Americans to hold back on these tariffs. And this process has been going on, continues now, but going on since January to March. That continues. Then our first response was $30 billion of tariffs that we've applied to a wide range of American goods coming into Canada. That was effective March 4th. We've continued as of last week with $29.8 billion additional tariffs. This was primarily targeted to steel and aluminum and some other products such as computers and sports equipment. And this is where we are now. We're at this stage now with roughly $60 billion in tariffs imposed on the Americans. Now, the thinking and the strategy in Canada is that if the Americans persist with tariffs and increase tariffs, add new tariffs, we have another $120 billion in tariffs that we're going to hit them with. And this is not pretty. This is going to be painful on both sides of the border. It already is, inflationary on this side of the border. It's going to cause employment losses in Canada and the United States. So nobody wants to go there. So that's why, number one is we're still trying to do number one, which is, educating, using our diplomatic representatives to kind of mitigate this, stop it as soon as possible, and press upon the Trump administration why these tariffs should be removed. In addition to the federal response, there have been a number of provincial responses, and you're familiar with Doug Ford's actions in Ontario with the electricity, for example, pulling the American liquor and beer off shelves, and BC's, I guess, threats to tariff or tax American truck trailers going through BC up to Alaska. Actions like this, provincial governments are also implementing as well. If you want more detail on, Canada's response to the tariffs, there's a link there at the bottom that you can follow. Next page, please. So what does Trump want? Very difficult to predict. It's almost like he wakes up every morning, throws some spaghetti on the wall and sees which strands of spaghetti will stick. It's difficult to determine, but based on what we know about precedent, media statements and the meetings we've had with our senior officials and theirs, I think there's a number of objectives here. He wants changes to Canada's dairy system and the tariffs on dairy and lumber as well. These are longstanding American grievances in Canada, years and years and years. If you're familiar with softwood lumber, the dispute, rekindles every 5 years, with the Americans trying to impose tariffs, duties on the Canadian lumber. He wants removal of Canada's digital services tax and the harmonized system tax. The digital services tax is proposing to hit a lot of American companies like the Googles and the Facebooks pretty hard. So they're lobbying hard to have the Trump administration get this removed. Ultimately, he wants more revenue for the U.S. government, and that's to be obtained through tariffs to fund what in the end will be hopefully his U.S. tax cuts and a reduction in the U.S. deficit. And then as well, another objective is more direct investment in the United States. In other words, attracting more Canadian and foreign businesses to establish a presence in the United States. That's why the whole Made in America, Made in USA process is going on. That's what he and his officials are trying to focus on. And then finally, it's ideological, right? There's a theoretical, ideological undercurrent or support to this, which is about protecting America, America First policy. I mean, I personally see this as a 19th century antiquated kind of version in an integrated economy where you have, products crossing the border several times. It's not like the 19th century where you be a protectionist and apply mercantilist policies to trade. In the 19th century, the United States made a product and it was exported somewhere. It was simple as that. And then France made a product and exported it to the United States. The product was wholly made in that country. Now products are no longer wholly made. If you look at, appliances, automobiles, computer components, these are all made in different parts of the world. So it's an integrated supply chain. And it's very, very difficult to disentangle that right now. But that's another attempt that Mr. Trump is trying to do. Next slide, please. Okay, what supports do we have for Canadian business? Well, there are actually a number of supports that the government has stepped up with to support Canadian business. I know there's also provincial government supports that are coming out too, but we have the Trade Impact Program, which our colleague from EDC might mention this afternoon. BDC has a new half billion-dollar loan program, new money, called Pivot to Grow, which is intended to support Canadian businesses that are impacted by tariffs in various sectors. If you're an agricultural product producer, Farm Credit Canada, FCC, another Crown Corporation has a new program called the Trade Disruption Customer Support Program. That's $1 billion in new financing. And then finally, Ashley alluded to it as well, but the Department of Finance has what's called a remission program. The remission program is for Canadian companies that are finding the Canadian tariffs on imported components, imported inputs that they use into their production process. They're finding these Canadian tariffs to be to raise the cost of the product. So they can apply for a remission or a removal of those tariffs or a reduction of those tariffs to Canada's Department of Finance. So this is not an American duty or American tariff that is implemented. This is actually a Canadian duty that is causing a rise in your production, the price of your production inputs, and therefore raising the cost of producing your final product in Canada. So you can apply for a remission there. Now, my understanding is I talked to a couple of companies who've done remissions in the past. It does take a bit of time, several months. It's a fairly complicated application. As Ashley mentioned, you have to kind of indicate, what the loss is and whether that technology or product, can only be obtained from the U.S. market and it can't be made here in Canada. So you have to kind of prove that as a Canadian company. So a little bit difficult there. Next slide, please. In terms of strategies to mitigate the effects of tariffs, there's a number of strategies, but I guess first the good news. Tariffs only apply to products that cross the border. So for the current period, we're not talking about services that you provide to your U.S. customers or technology that is exported there, like a digital transfer of a software program or an app. Those are not affected at the moment. It's only manufactured products made in Canada that cross the border. Or even not made in Canada, but any product from Canada that crosses the border is tariffed at the U.S. border. So it's a product-specific, product-targeted set of instrument, the U.S. tariff. In terms of some strategies to potentially mitigate these tariffs, and this comes from our colleagues at the U.S., the Canadian Embassy in Washington, try to review some existing contracts and agreements that you have with your suppliers and buyers. I mean, look at your term lengths, try to renegotiate those, right? You want to mitigate some of the costs that are potentially coming up, maybe lower some of your costs or find alternate suppliers. Review or change your supply chain. You might want to do a SWOT analysis, again, identify alternate suppliers. If you have, shipping and logistics arrangements, you may want to get quotes from other brokers, freight forwarders to see if, you can get a bit of a better rate going to your U.S. customer. If you're not working with a customs broker, you really should be, because they're the ones who are going to determine, country of origin for your products. So as I said, kind of in one of the previous slides, customs compliant products are exempt for the time being from tariffs. So who could help you kind of determine if it's customs compliant? Well, it's a broker, right? A customs broker. So that broker can be found through, for example, industry association called the Canadian Society of Customs Brokers. They have a list of brokers on their website that if you don't have a broker, you definitely should be consulting one, especially in this environment. Next slide, please. Look at your pricing. Look at the different scenarios on your pricing. What is the pricing if tariffs are applied? If de minimis is removed, which is de minimis is for smaller orders that cross the border, small value products. It's a tax exemption or a tariff exemption for those products. If de minimis is removed, then what's the effect of the cost of shipping a $100 product, $200 product over the border? If you've enjoyed a healthy, generous margin in the past, maybe you were at 50%. We have a currency difference as well, where we have a bit of an advantage there. Can you squeeze that a bit? Can you reduce your margins to take into account the impact of a tariff? at least this might help you survive and stay in business. And then, and I say survive and stay in business because, for example, in 2017, the Trump administration applied tariffs on steel and aluminum. However, Canada, lobbied and negotiated. We had those removed within a year. So I don't know what's going to happen here with the current tariff situation. I'm not guaranteeing this is going to be removed or anything, but this is something you can kind of temporarily do to consider, surviving into next year and the following years. You could move or stock your product over the border while there are no tariffs. So this is an interim solution. But if you're a company that has warehousing and storage in the United States, maybe take advantage of the situation now and stock up in the United States, anticipating perhaps greater tariffs on April 2nd. Retaining your current customers is really important. And in the United States, you have to pay attention to your customers. You have to really, really provide customer service to them. And they may ignore other suppliers locally in the United States if they're getting great service from you. And they'll stick with you and be loyal with you. So I think that's really, really important. It's a lesson a lot of Canadian companies maybe don't think too much about, but it's critically important in the United States, where customer service, client service is very, very important. And in the mid to long term, look at diversifying your customer base. Look at trade diversification, export diversification for your company. I speak to a lot of Canadian companies. They've got 90% of their exports in the United States market. I mean, that is, it's a great market. It's a big, deep market. It's huge. It's 11 times the size of Canada. You can make significant sales. It's right next door, same language, almost the same culture, open account transactions. It's a great market. It has been great for 50 years. But maybe now is the time to start thinking about, let's diversify into new markets. Is Mexico an option? Is the UK an option? Maybe other English-speaking markets, Australia, and so on. Next slide, please. So diversifying your trade is part of what we do and we encourage at the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service. Next slide, please. And in terms of some of the programs and services, we have a number that we can help with Durham companies and Canadian companies in general. We are an international network. We're part of Global Affairs Canada. So we are the federal government, but we are the business division, the business development division for Global Affairs Canada. And we've been around for a long, long time. We don't do a lot of advertising. Our friends at EDC and BDC have really big ad budgets, which is great for them. We don't have those big ad budgets, but we've been around for 125 years. We have about 30,000 customers in Canada. And, I'm one of the regional offices here in Canada. I'm in the Toronto office. We cover Ontario companies, but we have 160 offices in over 100 countries with about 1,100 trade commissioners all around the world. In the US, we have 16 offices. So next slide, please. So we are around the world. We've been there for over 100 years, and we're really, really happy to help your company. Next slide, please. That's our regional business network. I mentioned I'm in the Toronto office. There are 5 other regional offices across Canada. So if your company doesn't happen to be headquartered in Ontario, maybe you're in Quebec, I can refer you to our Montreal regional office or to other regional offices that could serve you as well. Next slide, please. We do have a little bit of criteria for our clients. We want to work with companies who have a bit of an export plan. Maybe they've done a little bit of research and selected their target market. So it wouldn't be a company that comes to us and say, well, where should I export to? You might want to have leads and some linkages already into another export market. Exporting is expensive. Doing business internationally is expensive. As a company, you need to be serious about putting financial and human resources toward this. And it's not instant. Maybe you can make a sale in the United States in a month or two. In other places like Europe and Asia, it might take a year or 2 years to establish a foothold and establish some traction to make your first sale. We like to see Canadian content in your product, service, or technology. We're the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service. So if you're importing a foreign-made product and you're putting a wrapper on it, we probably will not be able to assist you. But if you're developing that product in Canada or technology in Canada, and you have personnel here, and you have good, strong linkages to Canada, you're going to bring more growth and production and more sales to Canada, then yeah, this is the kind of company we want to speak to. I'll note as well that if you do have a company representing you, like if you have a consultant or an agent or representative, somebody who's not a direct employee of your company, we'll ask for an authorization letter from, C-level of your company, just authorizing that person to work on your behalf. Next slide, please. We have 4 services that we can provide to our clients. We can help you prepare for international markets. We'll help you assess your market potential. That could be something like, for example, I've got a product, XYZ product. Can you help me assess whether that would sell in Mexico or in the UK? Determining that sort of feedback from our trade commissioners in those markets. They can tell you very clearly and very quickly, whether that product is priced correctly, whether there's competitive products in that market, and what might be the best method of entry to get into that foreign market. Qualified contacts is our most important and most heavily used service. Do you need a distributor? Do you need a rep? Do you need an accountant in Germany? Do you need a rep in Brazil? Do you need a translator in Malaysia? We can provide qualified contacts that can help you with all of these tasks, because that's what you're going to need as you expand internationally. You cannot use, well, you shouldn't use your Canadian accountant or your Canadian lawyer to help you in Malaysia or in Germany. You should use local professionals in those markets, and we have those contacts available for you. And then resolving problems is, of 2 types. It's helping you with, if you have a product stuck in a border or you're stuck in a warehouse, we can find out why it's being stuck there, or if, for example, you are having a market access issue. Maybe you're being stopped at a border or your visa's not being declined. At least we can kind of have a quick look into it and see what's happening there. And of course, these services are provided at no cost to our qualified clients. Next page, please. Free trade agreements. I actually mentioned CETA. CETA is one of our Canada's free trade agreements, but there are many others. We have about 15 free trade agreements that cover about 60% of the world's gross domestic product. So this really opens doors for Canadian companies. Next slide, please. Here are the markets indicated in colored version where we have trade agreements. The light blue on the left is CUSMA, Canada, US, Mexico agreement. The purple in the middle, that's CETA, that's the European Union, 28 countries. And the red is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, about 12, 13 countries we have there, which are part of the TPP agreement that Canada has. Next slide, please. What do free trade agreements do for your company? Well, the number one benefit is they drop tariffs. So 98% of the products, Canadian-made products that you're looking to export to those markets will go into that market tariff-free. So that means that your landed price, when you land that product in Indonesia or Germany, the landed price is lower. So it's more competitive. The product is more competitive with local products in that market. So that's one thing that they do. They help you integrate your supply chain as well. So free trade agreements are 2 ways. So if you're using a production input from Indonesia or Germany, that product will enter Canada tariff-free, okay? Because we have an FTA with that country or region. So that lowers the cost of your production inputs if you're a manufacturer, for example. It lowers the risk for service providers and investors abroad. So our modern free trade agreements have provisions that allow mobility for business people, business executives, like the C-level of your company or VPs of your company, sales leaders in your company, to travel to those markets more easily than they did before that free trade agreement was in place. And then we also have investor protection clauses. So say, for example, you wanted to go to Spain and buy a company to create a partnership in Spain. Well, that investment is then protected. That company can't be expropriated by the Spanish government. It's protected by the free trade agreement we have with Spain and the European Union there. As I said, it eases business travel to partner countries, so it allows reduced visas or no visa travel to many of our FTA partner countries. And then finally, it's that whole harmonization of technical standards and product standards. Many Canadian companies have found that entering markets like the EU, for example, or other markets where product certification, product standards are a bit of impediments, the non-tariff barriers to enter those markets. The FTAs we have now, seek to mutually recognize credentials and product standards for similar products. So that means we would recognize, for example, German-made baby carriers, and the Germans would in turn recognize Canadian-made baby carriers. So those standards that were in place, the safety standards, for example, are now mutually recognized. It allows the companies that make baby carriers, for example, to enter the market more freely, more easily, and sell into that market. Next slide, please. A little bit about export funding programs. We do have funding programs to help Canadian companies underwrite some of the costs of international business development. Next slide, please. The first is CanExport SMEs, which just opened last week. The SMEs program just opened last week. This one can help your company subsidize about 50% of the cost of international business development. Next slide, please. It can cover things like business travel, flights to the market, participating in trade shows and trade missions and conferences, and a number of other expenses there. These are normal expenses that a Canadian company would find in terms of developing their international business in different markets. Next slide, please. This program could provide up to $100,000 or $50,000. It's a 50-50 cost share program. So you can apply to that program. It is, as I said, is open now for expenses that might be eligible after April 1st. So happy to provide more guidance there. Have a look at the link first, though, before you contact us. Most of the questions that you might think about are answered in the applicant's guide in that link for CanExport SMEs. Next slide, please. Next program is called CanExport Innovation, and this one is specifically for Canadian researchers who are collaborating with foreign partners to commercialize a new product, a new service or technology. So this is similar to CanExport. It provides some of the same relief from costs and working with foreign partners, but this is a 75-25 split. So 75% from the Canadian government, 25% from your company. Next slide, please. Next slide. One more slide, please. Okay, and finally, this is an industry association, CanExport. It's called CanExport Association. So if you belong to an industry association like, the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association or the Canadian Music Association, you could benefit from this particular agreement. It funds industry associations to help prepare Canadian companies for international expansion and, for example, to support some of the costs of trade shows that maybe the country music association is doing in Spain or in the US, for example. Great. Look, if you're a member of an industry association, have a look and see if your association actually has applied to this program. If not, they should, and if they're a national association, they should consider applying. Next slide, please. Please do follow us. We're on X, Twitter, and we'll follow you. Lots of information there on trade missions that we take out. Events here in Canada. We feature successful Canadian exporters sometimes as well, too. A great little social media site to be on. Next slide, please. And if you want to keep up to date on things like trade missions, events, conferences, developments in exporting and international business, sign up. It's free of charge. It's called MyTCS, My Trade Commissioner Service. You put in your markets of interest, your countries of interest. You put in your sector, whether you're, clean tech company or ICT company, and then this website pushes information out to you based on your sector and market interests. That is it. Thank you very much. Oh, a couple of, I don't know, that's okay. We go to the step-by-step guides, but there are a couple of guides there that might help your company kind of think about taking first steps in international markets and diversifying your trades. In particular, that step-by-step guide is very, very useful because it literally takes you step by step on what you need to think about as you look to enter new international markets. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I guess I'm up next. I think everybody can hear me okay. As for maybe loading the slides, just thank you so much, Maylene, for that introduction at the beginning, and just want to say thank you to Invest Durham and the Clarington Board of Trade for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here to be talking about how we can support businesses in Durham as they navigate this tariff uncertainty and just general market uncertainty, and how we can support with trade diversification. There we go. I think the slides are loading. As Maylene mentioned at the beginning, I just wanted to reiterate, my name is Nina Garcia, and I'm a relationship manager with EDC, working with mid-market companies that are based anywhere between Toronto all the way to Peterborough, so very much including the Durham region there. In the next slide, I always like to start off with just like a general overview of EDC for those who may or may not be very familiar with us. Export Development Canada, or EDC, is a federal crown corporation, and we're also Canada's export credit agency. Basically, we're dedicated to helping Canadian companies succeed in international markets. We've been doing this for over 80 years. We've been providing financial solutions, market intelligence, and business connections to support Canadian exporters. And we work with companies of all sizes, industries, and sectors to help them succeed in global markets. In the next slide over, you'll see that our mission is to use our unique trade knowledge and financial solutions to develop trade between Canada and other countries and to enhance Canada's competitiveness in the international marketplace. As I said, Export Development Canada, we're here to support Canadian exporters. And I always like to level set on what an exporter is, or essentially what our definition of what an exporter is at EDC, because it is quite broad. We actually have 3 categories, as you see there on the screen, of what we consider exporters. So first of all, we have direct exporters, pretty straightforward. If you sell your products outside of Canada, you're a direct exporter. But I always like to mention, and Bill mentioned this too, that this also includes service providers. So if you're a service provider and you have an international client, well, we consider you a direct exporter as well. The second category that we have there is indirect exporter. So essentially, this includes companies that sit anywhere within the supply chain of a product that is then exported. So some industries that come to mind that are highly integrated into the global supply chain are industries like automotive, aerospace, mining, oil and gas, just to name a few. But essentially, if you're a Canadian company that is selling to another Canadian company that is then selling abroad, well, then that's an indirect exporter for us at EDC. And the last category we have there is a future exporter. So if you haven't started exporting yet, but you're planning on doing so in the next 1 to 3 years, well, we can help you get started. I would say that probably if you're tuning into this webinar, you're most likely fitting into one of these 3 categories. So in the next slide, you're probably wondering, okay, so how does EDC support exporters? How can we support exporters, especially right now with all of the current tariff uncertainty that we're facing? As Bill mentioned in one of his slides, EDC recently announced the Trade Impact Program, which is essentially an enhancement of our existing solutions. I'm going to go through a few of those solutions, but essentially the ones that are highlighted in the slide here in this teal color are the ones that fall within the program. So given all that's going on, what are some of the strategies that you can implement and how can we support you right now? So first of all, in terms of risk mitigation, the first thing that comes to mind is taking a look and mitigating contract risk. So very much both your current and your future contracts and protecting yourself against the risk of non-payment from your foreign buyers, especially as your accounts receivable probably represent a large chunk of your balance sheet. This should definitely be top of mind. And one way to do that, one way to mitigate that contract risk is by getting accounts receivable insurance or credit insurance. So with EDC, we do offer EDC credit insurance. It protects 90% of your receivables, and it can cover repudiation and contract cancellation, both of which have been on the rise recently, and we expect that to keep on rising. Credit insurance also allows you to extend payment terms for your buyers if needed. So especially right now, if products are getting stuck at the border for a longer period of time, you might want to extend longer payment terms for your buyers. With EDC credit insurance, we also provide it's quite flexible and customizable policies. We can cover both your foreign buyers or your domestic buyers, or we can cover just your foreign buyers. We can cover a select number of buyers. So for example, if you're just worried about your US buyers right now, we can do that. Or if you want to spread the risk out and cover your entire book of receivables, we can do that as well. So really just depends on your needs. We're here to see what works and what makes most sense for you. So don't hesitate to reach out and we can chat about that. The second thing is something else to keep in mind at the moment is with the current market uncertainty, there's also been a lot of foreign exchange fluctuations. So a lot of US CAD volatility that's making it very difficult to predict and manage that kind of financial risk and protect your business. So with that in mind, you may want to consider some foreign exchange hedging strategies. For example, forward contracts or currency options to lock in future exchange rates. Something else to consider is perhaps having a chat, negotiating with your suppliers to see how you can maybe pay them in their local currency instead of US dollars at the moment. And all of this can be done either through a foreign exchange broker or through your own bank. So definitely could be a good idea to have a discussion with your financial institution about how to mitigate that foreign exchange risk. And how can EDC help with this? Well, usually if you're putting in place a hedging strategy, either an FX broker or the bank will require some collateral to be tied up. And EDC has a foreign exchange guarantee that allows you to free up that collateral. So essentially, we provide 100% guarantee so that you can use that collateral to as working capital as you would. And speaking of working capital, the next bullet point over, for companies, for those of you who have already been impacted by tariffs, that's probably having an impact on your cash flow and your liquidity at the moment, and perhaps you're in need of additional working capital to be able to manage that cash flow, to be able to maintain your operations or even grow your operations. At the same time, this current uncertainty that we're seeing, perhaps your financial institution is a little bit less comfortable right now in lending additional financing. And again, this is where EDC can come in. We have a few different guarantees that are meant to take a portion of your bank's risk so that you can access that additional financing. So essentially, we'll work with your bank to support you on your operating line or your term loan or a CapEx loan. Like I said, there are different EDC guarantees in this sense for working capital, some of them that share your bank's risk, some of them it's a risk transfer to EDC. So definitely worth having a chat if that's something that's that you need at the moment. And lastly, on the slide, in terms of expanding abroad, so perhaps this was already part of your growth strategy for this year or the next years, or now it's become very apparent that you may be looking to expand, or maybe you're looking to open an office abroad or make an acquisition either in the US or elsewhere. This is also where EDC can support with financing. So in the next slide, essentially now we've covered some of the financial solutions that we can help with in terms of risk mitigation, but also to get you started in terms of diversifying your markets. In terms of trade diversification, essentially the need for Canadian companies to diversify has never been more apparent, as both Bill and Ashley have mentioned. It's really important to start thinking about that in terms of diversifying not just your consumer base, but also your supplier base. We've both heard from the presenters before me that Canada has 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries and nearly 2/3 of the global GDP. What that means is that Canadian companies have an advantage and essentially preferential market access to over 50 countries. And not to sound too cheesy, but I think the world needs more Canada. But yes, diversifying does certainly have its challenges. It doesn't happen overnight. It's more of a medium-term strategy. But how do you even start? So first of all, there's a lot of on-the-ground support. You heard from TCS that they have offices in pretty much every country around the world. EDC also has several representations abroad. This kind of gives you a sense of our footprint. EDC is also part of the federal government's Indo-Pacific strategy, and we have opened many representations in the region. Essentially, all of these representations have an objective of helping Canadian companies navigate the complexities of doing business in that market, and they're there to help facilitate business opportunities. So on-the-ground support is just one of those resources. In the next slide, I've also included kind of an overview of additional non-financial resources to help you with trade diversification, to help you getting started. So it really, depends where you're at that journey. Perhaps you're looking to identify a new target beyond the US, or perhaps you've already been selling into Europe and now you want to tap into opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. Whatever it is, at whatever journey stage you're at, it's really important to do that market research. Gather market information, put together a market entry strategy. And EDC has a lot of market intelligence, expertise, and just knowledge to help you support with that. We have country guides, we have sector guides on our website. We have an agri-food hub on our website to talk about specifically opportunities in the food and beverage sector, which is a priority sector for us. We also have something called My EDC. And so if you're looking at, if you're having questions about custom requirements, business taxes, compliance, etc., I would highly recommend taking a look at our Export Help Hub, and I'll include that in the slides as well, kind of a link there, because as the name indicates, it's a hub to help you answer export-related questions. And it can be the specific questions you have. So for example, you may be wondering, what are the regulatory requirements of exporting food into Australia? You'll type that in, and that's already been answered. There's some information there and some resources to help guide you with that. And if you have a specific question that hasn't been answered yet, you can submit that to our trade advisors, and they can get back to you on that. So definitely worth checking out. There's a lot of information on tariffs there as well, but just highly encourage taking a look. It's free. You can sign up. It's worth the few minutes of signing up. And the last thing I'll just mention here is that, EDC is just one part of the puzzle. We are part of an ecosystem of international trade promoting organizations, and we're all here to support Canadian exporters. So definitely it's important to leverage some of these other programs I mentioned here. The Trade Accelerator program is another one that's free of charge, that will help guide you into putting together an export plan. And once you have that, perhaps that can help guide you into applying for CanExport funding. Once you have CanExport funding, that can help you attend trade shows and trade conferences where you can meet potential buyers, where you might need credit insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all here to work together, like I said, to support Canadian exporters. So always happy to have a conversation, have a call, understanding what your needs and challenges are at the moment, what your growth strategies are, and how can we support. And when I say we, I mean EDC, but also the broader ecosystem of trade promoting organizations. So with that, this just the next slide. You have my contact information there. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. I can see that we're kind of out of time, but happy to maybe take questions if we have time, or feel free to reach out to me. Always happy to discuss any of these solutions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nina. Hey everyone, Simon from Durham, and I'll close by saying that we probably aren't going to have time to get to Q&A, but I wanted to share our sincere thanks to our speakers today, Ashley, Bill, and Nina, and also to sincerely thank the Joint Chambers of Commerce and Boards of Trade from Durham Region for producing and putting on and promoting this webinar for us as part of the Durham Economic Task Force. So thank you all for joining us. It's been our pleasure to host this. If you do have additional questions for the speakers, please do put them in the chat, and we will endeavor to answer them in a follow-up email to all participants. We'll also be sending a copy of all the presentations today to all the participants following up to this. So with that, I will close the webinar. Thank you again for joining, and have a great rest of your day.